Okay, it's setting up in a few seconds. Okay, we are live. So welcome everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, so welcome to our third Saturday lecture for 2022. Thank you for being here. The Saturday lectures are brought to you by the Social Sciences Lab. We are a non-profit initiative that aims to support research, training, and networking among social sciences researchers in the MENA region. We are affiliated to Fatima Al-Firi Open University, a non-profit online international university, which believes that education should have no borders and quality education should be accessible by youth around the world, especially those from developing countries. So we're pleased to have you all of you here today. And Saturday lectures, they are open access lectures. So they're aimed at providing our students and members of the public with an understanding of social sciences issues related to the Middle East and North Africa region. So the first iteration of the lectures took place from March to September last year. And so now we're into the second run of the lectures. So we have with us here our guest speaker for today, Professor Badre. Professor Badre is a policy development expert and professor of social sciences at the Mohammed V University, Rabat, Morocco. Research seeks to analyze current norms that hamper the progress and livelihood of migrants, women, and youth as social groups, and aims at generating evidence-based recommendations for informing national and regional policies. Professor Badre was previously visiting lecturer at various universities in the US, Denmark, Germany, and Romania, and has spoken at over 400 international conferences and trainings. So, and on today's topic, what is the state of higher education policies in the Middle East and North Africa region like? So do existing infrastructures meet the needs of students and young academics? Where are we headed? So some of you have also shared in some of your questions prior to these lectures. We'll hope to address them at the end of the presentation. So, and here, so Dr. Professor Badre, thank you for being here today, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Stanley, for this nice introduction, and also like to thank the Social Sciences Lab and also the Fatima Al-Fihri University for this initiative, and also for inviting me to share my thought on the topic of public policies of higher education in the Middle East and North African region. Also welcome the audience, and I would be happy to answer questions after my lecture. And right now, just allow me to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, awesome.
Perfect. All right, so as the title goes, public policies for higher education in the Middle East and North African region. And just to make a very short and quick disclaimer, you know, the topic is very complex, given that it talks about higher education. And the geography is also big. We are talking about the Middle East and North Africa region, which include 19 countries, at least as far as the study of this paper is concerned. And also the topic of public policies is a very vast field. Therefore, the timing, or like the time of this lecture, may not cover every aspect about every country within the region, or every aspect about public policies on higher education, but it's going to pinpoint at some major trends and salient points that are the subject of several academic and policy studies in general. So I'll be focusing on 4 main points: the timeline of higher education policy landscape, and then look at the characterizing trends, some of the characterizing trends, not all of them, and then look also on the pending challenges in policy interface, and then suggest some recommendations. So to start with, theoretically speaking, knowing that the first university in the MENA region was founded by a woman in the Moroccan city of Fez in 859 before Christ, which is 1 century before the first European university was constructed, gives the MENA region let's say, the legitimacy to be called the cradle of higher education in the region. However, and unfortunately, the political turmoil coupled with the lowest level of intra-regional cooperation, dictatorship, corruption, conventional and hybrid wars, revolutions, and terrorism have turned the region into one of the most fragmented geographies. And this fragmentation is reflected in the higher education sector. Of course, considerable evolution cannot be denied. Therefore, we'll be looking first at the timeline of the higher education policy, which I summarize into 5 main, let's say, stages. So the policy landscape of higher education in the MENA has gone through considerable evolution since the second half of the 20th century, especially with the dawn of independence of most of the Arab states, when several nations got their independence. And back then, several national governments passed higher education laws that led to the establishment of few universities with the mission to oversee existing institutes, faculties, and schools. And then the sector has been, since then, has been regulated and controlled by the state through the Ministry of Higher Education, of course, taking into consideration the variation in the naming of this agency in itself, but the ministry has become the body that assigns operational mechanism for implementing policies and establishing national commission to oversee implementation of the laws, and also the body that operate public educational facilities, allocate annual budget spending on public education and scientific research. So the first phase, as you can see on the slide, you have like the one right after the independence of most of the Arab states. Of course, there are a variety in terms of the date of each Arab state independence, but that start like by the 50s. So through starting from the 50s, we started to see that governments indulge in legislating laws for the establishment of university unit and scientific research academies. Although these states had their independence, we can still say that the higher education regulatory framework was still shaped by that of the colonizing state policies. So, of course, the state got their independence, but higher education system, given the fact that it was still at its infancy, with the exception of, let's say, Egypt and Damascus, or like Syria, because Egypt had, back then, had 2 universities. And when I say 2 universities in the modern form, or the modern conception of a university. So there was the University of Alexandria and Cairo, and then there was the University of Damascus in Syria before even independence. But then post-independent era, we started to see the blooming of universities in different Arab states. But again, when we looked at the managerial structure, the program curricular, the language of instruction, the faculty body were still the heritage of the colonial power. And then came the second phase between the 70s and the 90s. At that time, Arab leaders had to implement reforms that shattered social contract, because the alternative, which is usually business, appeared to be even more worse. So therein, we started to see that the higher education sector moving toward more independence from colonial heritage. And then we could see that the process of Arabization of program curricular, as well as Arabization of human resources, and then both administrative and academics, and then diversification of the fields of studies as well as degree programs. And then the third phase, which started between the 90s and 2000, that's the structural reform phase. It started right after the Cold War and also during the Iraqi-Kuwait crisis. And these are two very important historical events that influenced the perception of the Arab leaders, and then veer their attention toward considering reform of higher education. So higher education policy making was more inward at this stage, in the sense that it focused rather on reforming higher education institutes governance by putting forward restrictive measures in order to control the financial as well as the intellectual autonomy of the university, thus aligning the academic and scientific knowledge production to the ruling regime's agenda and governing models. Of course, the consequences of this policy strategy in the third phase would have like ramifications in the fourth phase, which is, I would call it the expansion and reform of the reform phase, which started with the Arab uprising in 2011 and then stretched until 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic. So the fourth phase came as a reaction to the Arab Spring with the erosion of several regimes. And this stage was the culmination of 4 decades of failing higher education policies. The impetus for this education reform was derived from the ongoing economic crisis. Hence, it was necessary to implement reforms that would respond to the dangerously high level of youth unemployment that characterized and still characterizing actually the Arab world. So in other words, the inability of the Arab youth to find suitable employment was the result of an education system characterized by outmoded pedagogy, insufficient public funding, and inappropriate training for the 21st century workplace. It is argued here that the leaders in the Arab world realized above all that the situation could be regime threatening. So they had to implement change and reform of the policies of higher education. And then 2020, we have been witnessing the COVID-19. And this is the fifth phase, which I would call the post-pandemic era, where we are right now. And this could be a paradigm shift in the higher education policy making arena, as it could be, and as it represents a leapfrog for the sector if policymakers know how to take advantage of both what digitalization has to offer, as well as the peak of youth dividend that the region is actually undergoing. So these two factors could be or could turn the higher education system within the region into an opportunity if policymaking also undergoes like a paradigm shift. Now, the question is, I'm sorry, before I raise that question, I'll talk about the characteristic that feature the policymaking in general. If we look at the strength in the policymaking, since the colonial, or like the post-colonial, or like since the independence of the region, policymaking of higher education, as well as in other sectors such as economy and politics, is very competitive, highly dynamic, responsive, and forward-looking, in the sense that despite all the problems that the sector is witnessing and all the handicaps that slow down the performance of higher education and the scientific research in the region, policymakers are still aware of the exigencies of the era within which we are. That's why we see that policies, even though they date back in the post-colonial era, but like there are always new decrees of laws and update of legislations that accompany the changes and the demand of each era. And it is also competitive because it aligns with the other policies of other regions, especially OECD countries, since like this is the country which is closer geographically and also in terms of structure to the region, mainly European countries. And then it is forward-looking because when you read the policies or the intention behind the policies and the visions that each country has, because most of the countries in the region, they have like a Vision 2030 or Vision 2025 or a vision that align with the SDGs. So they have a forward-looking vision. However, when it comes to the implementation, then we face structural handicaps. And one of the weaknesses that characterize policy making of higher education in the region is restrictiveness. It is very restrictive in the sense that it does not give autonomy to the university as an independent unit, independent both in terms of financial management and also in terms of knowledge production. It is also a normative law because it's linear. It aligns with the state more than with the demand of the society and the livelihood of the youth, since they are the ones concerned with higher education. And then it is reactive, irrelevant in the sense that it does not match the demand of the job market, the demand of the economic evolution, and also the demand of the aspiration of the youth. So that's why I would say that the policies are irrelevant and also reactive because they don't, they are not forward-looking, but they are rather a reaction to a situation, to the present or like a current situation. And this like drives me to the question, what is the linking point across the five phases policy making has gone through in the region? If we look again at the this chart, the five phases that policy making has gone through share the fact that they are responsive to a crisis. They are not visionary in the sense that like when we started the founding of the policy founding phase, that was right after independence. So it was a reaction to a crisis. And then we have the reforming phase. For example, the higher education policy making in the MENA region was a reaction to the economic crisis that the world went through in the 70s. And then we have the structural reform. This was a crisis, as I just mentioned. It was like the world was just coming out of the Cold War, and then the region was coming out, or like experiencing the Iraqi Kuwaiti crisis. And then we have 2012, or the fourth phase that started right with the Arab Spring, and then it stretched to the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. That is also was the crisis, the political crisis that witnessed the erosion of several political regime in the region. And then the fifth phase comes with the global health crisis. And if we look at all those phases, of course, the outcome in terms of policies were considerable, and they contributed in the expansion of the infrastructure of higher education, universities that reach now almost 800 universities in the 19 countries in the region, and then more than 3,000 higher education institute and research centers. And of course, 5 million enrolled students. So these are very big numbers, and of course, we reach these numbers thanks to those policies. However, the policies are not, they don't come with a vision, but they come as a reaction. And if I would like to give an example on policy, the mindset of policy making in the region is like, you know, in some countries, like especially Northern Shore or the OECD countries, when they build a bridge, for example, they build that bridge and then they set a timeline for that, like expiration date for that bridge. And then they also set times where they have to repair it or to maintain it or whatever. Unfortunately, in the region, when we do build that bridge, we just build it and then leave it. As long as it is operational and functional, it does not have any expiration date. So when we would revisit that bridge only if it breaks down. And that applies to any form of policies. Policy development in the region in general, of course, there are exceptions, but in the region, they are not proactive, they are reactive to a crisis, which means that, and the problem with that is that when you are trying to solve a problem because of crisis, you are under time and resources constraints. Whereas visionary policy would look at the future, like maybe 10 or 30 or 60 years vision. So you are not under any kind of constraint. So you have enough time to go through foresight analysis of the available and then the visionary data in order to come up with the sort of futuristic and more innovative policy suggestions, or like policy making in general. Now, the challenges that the higher education policies in general are still facing in the region, we have the top-down policy approach and lack of accountability. The higher education policy making in the region is opaque, and that is part and the parcel of the autocratic regimes with the very weak instruments of accountability. There are many academics and experts and agencies, both governmental and non-governmental agencies and public officials who do understand at least part of the policy-making processes, but they feel unable to comment on them in details, and they are bound by political prudence or rules of confidentiality. For the rest of us, as practitioners of within the field of higher education in general, there is the risk of two major analytical traps that we are faced with. First, we observe the outcomes of policies and then read backward to assume that the policies beneficiaries were responsible for its adoption. Our understanding, of course, and effect may be off target. And the top-down reform is probably the only way reform will be initiated, let alone sustained. So as a factual, we can try to imagine what bottom-up reform would look like. It would involve much greater activism on the part of elected officials and students and faculty members and coalitions of universities. However, such form of activism is unfortunately relatively absent in the Arab world. So it is easy to assume that the weak accountability afford authoritarian leaders the ability to make unpopular decisions and to take bold actions. But weak accountability is a two-edged sword, along with the bold action. Leaders may prefer to remain relatively passive, even in the face of discontent or imminent crisis. So in the education sphere in general, weak accountability in the Arab world is as likely to lead to inertia and then conflict as to bold actions. And maybe this is the case that we are witnessing in several states where there's dissatisfaction and dissatisfaction of faculty members, of students is prevailing, but still it's not leading to bold actions. Then the second factor is poor governance. it was thought that the Arab Spring was certainly going to affect the governance system of higher education, probably in the direction of more independence and participation and partnerships, both local and international. However, the sad fact is that with a few partial exceptions, maybe we can talk about exception in Morocco, Tunisia, and Jordan. The Arab uprising have resulted in much educational destruction of infrastructure and more control of the intellectual freedom, as we have seen, for example, I believe in Turkey in 2016, when was the attempt for the military coup, which led to the sweeping purges of university and faculty and administration. So the basic trend in governance and governance reform means that progress, although slow, toward greater institutional autonomy is underway, but like it's very prudent, and it may yield very insignificant results because the political will, it's still not a consensual spirit that is characterizing the region. We have some countries such as Qatar and the United Arab Emirates who are taking the lead for innovating and restructuring the governance of policy making. But other or most countries in the region, they're not willing to take that step yet. And then the third challenge is the mismatch and the lack of relevance. There is now extensive literature on the youth bulge and demographic dividend and the waithood and the educated unemployed. What should be a great opportunity, unfortunately, which is the demographic development of the MENA region, in which 60% of the population are the youth, is actually turning into a political time bomb. Fertility rate in the region, once among the highest in the world, but it's tending to go downward for a couple of decades. The job skill mismatch is twofold. Formal sector employers allegedly cannot find the type of employees they are seeking for the kind of the evolving job requirements digitalization has imposed. And then we have the informal sector, the vast gray economy beyond the state's regulation soaks up educated and uneducated youth in low skills and then low tech jobs. So the educated are overqualified for this kind of jobs, and also for the kind of the informal sector, which is like prevailing in the region. On average, we have about 25%, only 25% of qualified youth get infiltrated into the public sector. However, the informal sector absorbs 40% youth, and then the private sector takes about 10%. And of course, these statistics are from the World Bank. And then the informal sector is where many young Middle Easterns and the North Africans spend their waithood period. And the waithood period could stretch from 2 to 7 years. And this is really very serious thing. Additionally, the Arab world has a high rate of brain drain. And of course, this is the consequence of the waithood, in which the dream and aspiration and the level of vulnerability of the youth get increased. And that would encourage immigration and then brain drain. So the continued investment by the student and parents in tertiary education may reflect the inclination of the region educated youth to go abroad for employment. So over time, I think the statistics speaks about the rise from 20% of the young people who used to migrate to other countries other than their home countries to 60% in 2015. 2015, and that number, of course, has increased since the Arab crisis that was catalyzed in 2014 and 15 with the civil war in Syria. And then we have the other factor is the inefficient quality assurance. So quality assurance is something new that has been introduced in the region in the mid 2000, maybe 2005 to 2007. It was introduced by the World Bank partnership with the Arab world, and the university governance and the quality assurance program was aiming at addressing insufficient access to higher education, inconsistency in the quality of higher education, and it was also meant to address the discrepancy between the graduate skills and the skills demanded by the job market, and also to reduce the gap in terms of the gender gap, the female representation of higher education system, both within the student's body and also within the faculty and administrative body. So by 2012, about 14 Arab countries have engaged in some level of quality assurance. However, although institutions report that they have mechanisms in place to monitor achievement of their goals, the reality is far from what's being reported, because little evidence is found of systematic use of key performance indicators that were listed in the quality assurance measurements. So strategic planning and the rigorous measurement of progress toward goals are also always unpopular, both among university administrators and among faculty. And then accrediting agencies insist on this exercise, but it results most of the time into formulaic behavior without producing a change, because the outcome of those quality insurance evaluations, they are not enforced, but they are just turned into recommendations that they just most of the time they get lost along the way. And then the last challenge is the R&D. Of course, we all know that the contribution of each state in the financial contribution, of course, from the GPD of each state to the research and development is less than 1%. And that does not help neither the higher education system, nor the knowledge production, nor the society, nor the development. And, you know, we all know that Arab state has very good scientists who perform very well when they are provided with the working environment and the academic landscape and also the facilities abroad. But like when they work together within the region, we see like the performance is very slim, if not very shy, because Arabs in different institutions setting make up superb scientists, but only outside their countries. Within their own countries, the environment, the infrastructure, the policies and the governance does not help them to perform and give their maximum. So I would say that within the Arab region, the R&D, research and development, will suffer as long as policy mindset will remain as it is, and we will keep on having good players with a very poor team. So these are, of course, there are other challenges, mainly related to the question of internationalization, harmonization, and regionalization of higher education, but this is another topic. Of course, there is the question of mobility and exchange and partnerships. If I have time, and hopefully maybe during the Q&A session, we'll tackle those elements, because they are very important characteristics of higher education policies in the 21st century. Now, we'll talk about like few recommendations or like way forward that would respond to some of the challenges I have just addressed. So we all know that universities are pivotal to the world's progress toward realizing sustainable goals by 2030. So innovation is fostered at universities. Innovation which helps society to transform great ideas into pathways and platforms for sustainable development take place actually within the university arena. Therefore, it is essential for policymakers to formulate policies in such a way that would help and enable universities to implement sustainability in the delivery of the learning operation, their core operation and their contribution, not only to local communities, but to the global community in general. So it is up to the university to instill in the learner a holistic approach and quality education and awareness of global issues. This cannot happen if policies are not enabling universities to have that intellectual autonomy, financial autonomy, in order to waiver partnerships with both private and public sectors within the country and then outside the country. So what lies ahead for the Middle East and North African region is the opportunity to rise to the frontier of digital economy. And this leap forward will require a concrete effort to make long needed changes to educational policy approach and create a friendlier environment for new businesses, particularly in education technologies or edtech, and invest heavily in large-scale broadband internet infrastructure. So the current state of the education in the region is dismal, and youth unemployment rate in the region have been the highest because of the mismatch between skills and then the labor market requirements. Therefore, this point also need to be addressed. And during the pandemic, for example, universities have struggled to adapt quickly, shifting programs online without rethinking the pedagogy and the learner experience for a new format. So what higher education institutions were slow to understand is that the world today is very, very different to the one the university was designed to serve decades ago. So with the age of the internet, universities are tasked to build up a new kind of student, one that makes more ownership of his or her own learning. However, the university may not manage to leverage this service, the service of building an autonomous learner, when the university itself is suffering from lack of independence. So we need first to help universities have an autonomy in order for the university would reflect this philosophy in its approach and its interaction with the students. Therefore, policy development and policy making need to go into that direction. The future of education will be defined by content, technology, and the internet. So in a hyper-competitive and fast-evolving working environment, everyone will become a working learner, always flexing between working and learning in practice. This means that education system will have to adapt to offer more flexible upscaling and rescaling pathways to students and workers alike. Again, universities cannot implement such kind of programs and curriculum if they don't have the autonomy to do so. And not only the autonomy, but also the support, both financial and legal framework support. So instead of consuming education in bundles in higher education institutions, students will increasingly seek to acquire or improve market-driven skills in a shorter time or for less money. So the internet we were seeing, like for example, the example of Al-Fihri University is providing internet-based training or educational program, which enable marketplaces for the smallest niches, where learner as you go and learn model allow education to take place everywhere, anytime, and be hyper specialized. And I think this is the kind of model that we need policies to encourage. That's why I was talking about a crisis of innovation. Policies need to design an innovative outlook toward developing policies for higher education. Of course, this does not mean, by the way, that the university diplomas will become worthless. Of course not, because employers, especially in the region, in the MENA region, will always value reputation for a higher education institution. However, universities will have to adapt to provide a better quality for education. Again, this cannot happen if universities do not have their autonomy and freedom. And we have to also scale up the gains, because of course, during the 60 or maybe 70 years of the life of higher education within the region, and then of the life of the policy making in the region, there have been several gains. Of course, we cannot deny them. So we need to scale up those gains and then build up on them. However, countries will need to invest in infrastructure and undertake more significant changes in education system. Today, for example, we have 280 million people in the region, which is almost half of the population. It's 45% of the population are connected to mobile internet. So for countries like some Gulf countries, or even some North African countries, internet penetration is very low, and there is a problem of accessibility, affordability, and access to internet. So internet connectivity also remains a challenge in rural areas in most of the Arab region. So I think that broadband internet will be an indispensable commodity for education in the next years to come, and collapsing infrastructure will significantly stop the region from making a progress and a leapfrog toward, let's say, a digitally knowledge-based economy. Finally, attention needs to be directed to faculty members and administrators working in the sector of higher education. And also these faculty members and this human capital should be retained and then cared for and then trained and provided skills that would enable them to leverage the quality of education 21st century is calling for. So it is important to recognize that faculty members and professors and researchers in the MENA region and across the world have done a phenomenal job during the 2 years of the pandemic. And I think the next phase of higher education will require shift from, professor on the stage to middler in the middle, and in order for that professor to play this role of middler in the middle, he or she also need to have skills, both soft skills and pedagogical skills. I think I will stop here so that I leave some time for the Q&A session. Just to wrap up, is that this presentation was looking at briefly at the evolution of higher education policy in the MENA region, looking at 5 main phases, and then embarking on some of the characteristics, strengths and weaknesses characterizing higher education policy in the region. Then we looked at the challenges or pending challenges that are still slowing down the performance of policy making vis-a-vis higher education. And then I suggested some 5 recommendations. So thank you for listening.
Right, thank you so much, Professor Badre, for your precious inputs. It was a very comprehensive summary of the recent history of policy making in the higher education sector in the MENA region, and also some of the more pressing challenges that currently are still being present, and also the recommendations for the way forward. And definitely we already have quite a few questions. So for those of you on Facebook, please feel free to drop your questions as comments or as messages to us. And so we will now open the floor for questions. So I have a few, and actually I will put this on the chat so it's easier to reference. Oh, sorry, my video wasn't on. Okay. So we have a few, and the first question is, what is the impact of COVID-19 in the MENA region on education processes? I think that it was touched a bit on.
What is the impact of COVID-19 on
the MENA education processes in the MENA region?
Well, I mean, the actual impact as being lived were immeasurable, both on the students and then on the faculty members, as well as the whole sector of higher education. We have seen at the very beginning, maybe not only in the region, but this is like, since we're talking about the region, we have seen panic and sort of vulnerability because like we were not prepared. We were not prepared not because we didn't know that pandemic was coming, but because we don't have the infrastructure and the skills and capacities to shift from a conventional, traditional way of teaching into a more digitalized and virtual form of learning. However, the reaction was responsive and very swift, even though it was based on personal effort of administrators, of faculty members, of students and parents of the students. But at least the reaction was swift and was adaptable. Of course, we cannot deny the fact that the countries such as Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, they cope with the situation in a quite short time by establishing a partnership with national TVs in order to broadcast lectures on specific channels. They also established partnerships with internet providers in order for students to have free access to certain educational platforms. Universities also encouraged professors to digitalize content courses and make them available. So these are coping mechanisms that was not planned for, it was not written, but it was just a reaction to a situation. So that's during the actual period of the pandemic. Now, the pandemic is not only negative because like there are so many lessons we can draw from it, and one of them is that state of unknown, that state of blockage that the higher education system went through. And then it gave us time to look at ourselves in the mirror and see the weaknesses that our system is going through and the mismatch between what the system is offering and what the era is requiring. And I think many countries within the region are now devising policies and then reflecting on how to implement some of the lessons we drawn from the pandemic into policies. And one of them, for example, like many universities and many ministries of higher education now are thinking of integrating blended courses, distance learning, digitalization. And I think within the next 5 years, we will see the implementation and then the actualization of these policies in the real world. I hope I answered the question.
Thanks so much. And the next question it's quite long, so I'll just read it. So the next question, we know that educational policies in the Arab world have educational and productive goals at an advanced stage with the creativity and addition they offer to society. However, there are challenges that hinder it, including self-reliance and related to the state's decisions and its reform orientation. So this speaker says, the questioner is, it says, in my opinion, the main problem has two sides, namely supply. So you mentioned about Emirates and Qatar, which have material resources from oil. And a more interesting aspect is the adoption of modern and effective educational curricula. So not based on intellectual consumption in general. Okay, so that was the statement. Okay, so the question is, how can public policies for education change, in your opinion, in the current economic situation and after the corona crisis, which are new challenges for education in addition to social problems? And the second question related is the independence of public universities feasible in the MENA region through autonomy and freedom, and are legally and financially linked to the state? So I'll put it in the chat also. It's a long question. Thank you so much.
Oh, wow. So, well, thank you very much. I mean, whoever raised the question, thank you very much, because you touch upon several points that I highlighted, and also see that your opinion about some of the points I touched upon. So if I remember well, the first question was, how can public policies for education changing, public policies change in the region? If I remember the question well, the first part of the question. So look, I think that it's not public policies that need to first change. I think the mindset behind public policy making first needs to be changed, because whoever is making policies within the region need to change their mindset. Because if we don't change that mindset, policies is just the byproduct of people who devise them. So first of all, we need to change the mindset of policy making and understand that policies are made to serve a sector, not to control people. Therefore, if we don't change this mindset, we will not expect so much changes in the policies themselves. Now, how can we do that? We have to look at the fact that internationalization, and these are the 2 points I didn't cover, internationalization and inter-regionalization. Look, we live in a global world, and the global world has a lot of constraints and demands. If we want to catch up with it, we have to join, we have to join this trend. And in order to join the trend, we have to align our educational system policies with what's going on around the world. One of the characteristics that you can witness within our region higher education system, it's not attractive. Do we have mobility, student mobility? How many foreign students do we have and do we receive within our public universities, vis-a-vis universities in the UK and the United States, Germany, France, and many other. And now we have also South Korea, India, China. How many do we have? How many mobility of researchers and faculty members do we have within our universities, especially public ones and also private ones? They are not attractive. Why? Because they don't have that international scope. Why don't they have that international scope? Because educational system is not harmonized, is not compatible with most of higher educational system worldwide. Therefore, I'm sure that university policymakers and governments within our region, they are aware of that, and some countries have already started the process of harmonization and internationalization process, but it's taking so much time because you have to go back to different legislation that regulate accreditation, degree programs, and quality assurance, and so many other things. So until that happens, our region is going to stay like that. But our leaders, they are aware of this, and they don't want it to stay like this, because what happens if the situation stays as it is, we'll be just having a growing number of brain drain, and then instead of just creating academic and scientific hubs that would attract researchers, international researchers and academics and students, who would be just exporting our students and capacities. So I think there is a change taking place, but at a very slow pace, because government and policymakers are aware of the challenges and the demand globalization is imposing, but that's going at a very slow pace. Now, is independence of universities possible or not possible? It is possible. Everything is possible. There is nothing impossible. So what we need to change is, again, it's like the outlook of leadership and governance within the region. Look at 2 or 3 examples. Like look at South Korea, look at Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and look at Mauritius. These are 3 countries in 3 different continents. We have South Korea, we have Mauritius in the Pacific, and then we have the Qatar and Arab Emirates, which are in the region. These three countries, they are very small, they're very tiny countries, but they have done a revolutionary reform within their higher educational system. If you look at South Korea, maybe 40 years ago, especially in the 80s, like the higher education system within South Korea was poorer than what it is now within the region. But because of the political will and then the conviction that's driving a country toward a knowledge economy, will start with the reform of higher education system. And this is something that needs to be instilled within the mind of policymakers in the region, because we will not, and because the current situation is that our universities and our education system are busy trying to produce or to contribute to economy, to the market mobility and market movements. But what we need to focus on, or like to have in mind as an aspiration, as a vision, is creating not only graduates who have access to the job market. We have to create a mindset which is able to drive forward a knowledge-based economy, not just to keep the economy moving, but a knowledge-based economy. And in order to do so, we have to go through or undergo the reform and the policy decisions that South Korea took a few decades ago, and also the United Arab Emirates, which just took not even 20 years ago, Qatar, and now we see that Saudi Arabia also taking the same direction, Turkey as well, and then Mauritius has taken that decision a decade ago, and then we see the result, how now Mauritius is attracting so many international universities, implanting campuses within Mauritius state, and then we see that Mauritian students are not now leaving their countries. On the contrary, we see a lot of African neighboring countries are now moving to Mauritius to study in those international satellite campuses. I hope I answered the question. I think I finished.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for the comprehensive response. And I actually have 3 questions here. They are all about I think quite related to what you mentioned about mindset. So I will group them together. Okay, I'll put it on the chat. So these questions are: to what extent does the education philosophy in the MENA region reinforce the top-down structure and mindset behind education policy making? So what will it take to change? The 4th question is, how do family traditions affect attitudes towards education? And we also have a question: what inspiration can be drawn from Islamic traditions for higher education policy making? Yeah, so 3 questions, I grouped them together. Yeah.
These are very important, very good questions. To what extent does the education system, the education philosophy in the MENA region reinforce the top-down structure? It is not actually the education philosophy that enforces the top-down system. It is the political system. It's the political model that reinforces that and instill it within the university through the hierarchies of, the governing bodies within the university institutions, and the hierarchies, and instead of having a flat linear structure, we have that hierarchy, which is actually inspired from the political arena, the political sphere. So it's not the education philosophy that actually reinforce top-down philosophy, but it is being affected by the political regime. And yeah, when we come to university, not only because there is a misconception in the mind of the student within the region, they think that the professor is God and he has a complete power to rule over them, which is not true, because professors are also like, they are controlled. They're controlled by the system, by the administrative bureaucracy, by the policies, by so many things. So if just like the role were reverted, and then we put like a professor or faculty members in the chair, they would complain more than the student themselves. It's just something that professors don't talk about a lot, but it's something, it's a common knowledge. Now, family tradition affect attitude toward education. I think the family, the Arab family affects attitude toward education, and unfortunately it affects them in a very negative way, but because of good faith. I think if one thing a family can do within the Arab region is to change their perception about what success is. I think if we change our perception of what success is and then try to transfer this idea to our children, I think the whole perception about what higher education is and what is the purpose of higher education is would totally change. And this is very important because unfortunately, Arab families have understood success from a totally, let's not say wrong, but let's say currently irrelevant perspective. The way success used to be perceived by parent and grandparents is totally different. However, parents have not changed that perception and they are still transferring it to students. And that's why we are creating the kind of students we have, because they are after something called success, which is totally not success, but something else. And that's what's lead to creating the kind of young individual, the way they are, like they see success as different ways. So they are pursuing different roads that they think would lead them to success, but it's leading them somewhere else. And I can't remember what was the third question about.
Inspiration from Islamic traditions. What inspiration can be drawn for policy making?
This is a very difficult question for me. Look, I know that Islamic teaching must have laws and texts that would globally guide the direction of policy making, but I believe it would guide them from an ethical perspective. So I'm sorry, I don't have enough knowledge about this, but if there is anything Islamic education could help policy making, that would be the ethical perspective, the perspective of integrity of policy making and policy implementation.
All right, thanks, Professor. And now we have two questions that we'll group. Okay, we're kind of over the time a little, but if you don't mind, we'll carry on.
No problem, sorry.
All right. So we have two questions that are a lot more practical, so I'll group them together. So the first one is, how sufficient is the financial assistance system available to students? The second question is, what should we do about the job education mismatch? So if there are no new and innovative jobs, what can more education do?
The first one about financial assistance to students, it's very poor. It's for me, as far as I'm concerned, it's poor. It's not encouraging. Of course, we also should not ignore the fact that higher education, especially public higher education, is free. And of course, that puts so much financial pressure on each state's annual GDP. So of course, we have to also acknowledge that fact. However, like financial assistance is very poor, and it's inadequate, and it's not encouraging, not only to students, not only to undergraduate students, even postgraduate students, even researchers, even the junior researchers, they don't have any funding. Most Arab public universities, they don't have funding for researchers, or even research laboratories, they don't have fund. So most of research laboratories, they are inoperational. They don't do anything. They don't produce knowledge. They don't do research. And when they do, it's at the personal expense of those researchers. And those researchers are doing these personal research undertakings mostly because they need them for their promotion. So no, financial assistance is almost inexistent. And when it does, it's insufficient. I would say even it's humiliating. I don't remember the other questions.
So the other question is, what should we do about the mismatch? So if there are no new jobs, what can more education do?
No, I mean, it's not that there are no new jobs. Of course, there are new jobs. What we don't have is skills that would match those new jobs. So what we need to bridge the mismatch, of course, there is like plenty of literature that has done by academia, but also by NGOs and international agencies, such as the World Bank, matching or like bridging the gap between the mismatched job market and higher education has to go back to the school curricula, the university curricula, the skills that are being taught. We have to shift from teaching content to teaching to training and training students on skills, soft skills, communication skills, language skills, different kind of skills. Of course, that also taking into consideration the nature of the degree program we're talking about. But again, it has to go back to the school curricula and also the capacities of the faculty members. They also need to undergo professional training in order for them to be able to upgrade and update their teaching method, their teaching knowledge, and their teaching skills. Now, to do that, universities need to establish partnerships with private sectors, with companies, with businesses, with job providers, in order for them to have an understanding of what are the requirements of these job providers. And then on the basis of this data, then we can tailor or like design tailored programs that would train young people with the skill required for the job market. Of course, we do have that. I'm not saying we're not talking about in general, but there are like a lot of countries. I will talk about Morocco, for example, which has vocational training institutes that provide tailored training. However, these are institutes, and this is an approach of a professional and vocational training institute. This approach, this philosophy has to be generalized also within the university platform. Of course, some people might argue that, okay, within the social sciences and humanities, what kind of professional skills? Of course, we can and we should. There are like required professional skills, soft skills, communication skills, language skills that need to be incorporated, lifelong learning, social, different kind of skills that should be incorporated within different programs, be that applied sciences, social sciences, humanities, or education. So I think, yeah, there is so much work to be done at the level of the university by changing the curricula, the teaching pedagogy, and also the human capital capacity building, and also establishing partnership with the private sector. This cannot happen if universities do not have the autonomy to waiver this kind of partnership. So the state has to give more freedom, more space for universities to maneuver, and then to establish this kind of partnerships.
All right. Thank you, Professor. And I think we still have quite a few questions, but in the interest of time, we'll just have one last question. So I think it's a nice closure also. So the question is, it seems that there are many challenges, but are there any strengths in policy making in the MENA region? Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about what
I
are the
think I
strengths?
mentioned this at the very beginning. I talked about the strength of policy making in the region, and I repeat them. They are responsive, they are active, it's dynamic, they are not sleep. It's not like it doesn't move, it reacts to the changes, to the economic, political, social changes. So it is very dynamic. It is not proactive, unfortunately, but still it's active, it's reactive, it is competitive, because it's aware of what's going on in the region. They're aware of what's going on in the European Union, in North America, in Asia, in other parts of the world. So policies are, as I said, when you read policies and the intention behind them, yes, it's great. It's no less than many other universities around the world. The problem lies within the implementation and then the visionary scope of the policies. And I can't really remember what was the fourth one. It was, but of course, there are strengths within the policy. Otherwise, we wouldn't have reached the stage where we are right now. I mentioned that there are more than 800 public universities in the MENA region. We started with 3. Like before the colonial era, there were 3 universities. There was the University of Damascus, the University of Alexandria, and the University of Cairo. Now we are 800, more than 3,000 higher education institutes, and more than 5.6 million students enrolled within higher education. So we wouldn't have reached this kind of growth haven't we had the policies in place. But again, these policies, they are normative and they are reactive, they are restrictive. And that's why we need to develop another, to have another outlook toward policy making itself. Not in the making of the policy making outlook itself need to be changed, need to have an innovative approach to it before we start generating those policies.
All right, and thanks so much, Professor Badre, and also for entertaining all the many questions that have come in so far. So thank you so much for the insightful presentation and also for your very passionate responses to the students and audience. On behalf of the Social Sciences Lab, just wish to thank you finally for your time and also for your presentation today. Hopefully it will inspire a lot of our students who themselves are in the system of higher education, and it will give them an idea of how the policymaking process is like behind what they are currently exposed to and being a consumer of. Yeah, so many of our students at FAOU have also written some of their own opinions about education processes, and also some of them have written about education accreditation as like short pieces on the blog. So it seems that there is a lot of interest in reflecting on the state of.
If you don't mind, share them with me. That would be really nice. I'll be happy to read them if you could share them with me. I mean, you can send them via email later on, not now.
Okay, can of course. Yeah, so definitely, like I believe that many of them will benefit a lot from your presentation today, and some of them on live streaming us, joining us on live, and also some of them will be watching it afterwards after the live. So thank you so much for today. So we will now close the session officially, and thank you for the audience also for your attention and for your questions. We'll see all of you hopefully in the next Saturday lecture. So just follow the page for more information. So I will now stop the recording.